In the fall of 1983, an old college friend of mine, better known to you as Abigail Hastings, invited me to visit Judson Memorial Church. I'd been living in New York City for a few years, but I was definitely not in the market for a church. The truth is, after a lifetime of church attendance, I was burnt out. I was raised Southern Baptist. I grew up in the church. I was licensed to preach at 16. I was a ministerial student in college where I majored in religion. I had preached in churches, worked as a youth director in 2 or 3 churches, and one semester while I was in college, I even served as an interim pastor at a little country church, Oakdale Baptist, down in Raymer, Alabama. Y'all know where Raymer is, don't you? Not just above Grady, not too far from Ada, Alabama. You see, you take 331 south out of Montgomery, you pass Snowden and Canaan and Sprague. Once you get to Ada, you take a right on the dirt road behind the Amoco station. You go about 6 miles. You can't miss it. Now, sometime around my junior year of college, I began to have a lot of questions about my faith. Christianity, as I had come to know it, was making less and less sense to me. As the late comedian Bill Hicks used to joke, the great message of Christianity is eternal suffering awaits anyone who questions God's infinite love. It can be a bit confusing. As for the church, it was even worse. Every week, the same old hymns, the same old sermons, everything designed for your life in the next world, not this one. By my last year or so of college, I had had enough. I began studying theater, and after graduation, I moved to New York City to become an actor. But Abigail can be very persuasive, as I'm sure you know. She went on and on about how Judson was a different kind of church. For one thing, it was an American Baptist, not Southern Baptist, and it was extremely liberal, she said. And so on October 30th, 1983, Halloween Sunday, I visited Judson for the first time. Let me just say that as first impressions go, I found Judson to be rather wanting. The opening hymn was "A Mighty Fortress is Our God," and the choral prayer response was "There is a Balm in Gilead," 2 songs I could sing with my eyes closed. The liturgist for that Sunday was Reverend Howard Moody, a 60-something-year-old ex-Marine and former Southern Baptist sporting a flat top. Sister, please, if I had a nickel for every Southern Baptist with a flat top I'd had to listen to in my life, I'd be rich as Rockefeller. Howard read something by some feminist poet, and it was pretty good, I guess. But that was immediately followed by another congregational hymn, "Just As I Am." You have got to be kidding me. "Just As I Am" is the invitational altar call of far too many church services I attended growing up. It is 6 verses long. And inevitably, just as you'd be putting that 6th verse out of its misery, and you could smell your mom's roast beef and potatoes and could taste those homemade biscuits which were waiting for you if you could ever get out of church, the preacher would lift up his hand and announce to the congregation that even though no one had come forward to get saved or rededicate their life to Christ through all 6 verses of the invitational hymn, he was convinced that the Spirit of the Lord was at work amongst us today, calling out to someone. And dadgum, if he wouldn't start that whole song all over again. Let me tell you what. When Judson sang "Just As I Am" that Sunday, if looks could kill, Abigail Hastings would not be alive and sitting with you today. After we finished singing and Howard had read the scripture, a rather matronly-looking woman came forward to sing the special music. But by then, I had lost complete interest in all things Judson. I was busy contemplating what I was going to have for brunch, paying no attention to the singer until the darndest thing happened. She began to undress. Hello. Judson suddenly had my undivided attention. Slowly unbuttoning her blouse and unzipping her skirt, she continued to sing. Not fully believing what I was seeing, I looked over at Abigail, and I was grinning from ear to ear. Now, granted, the singer was no centerfold, but naked is naked, and in church no less. The more she sang, the more clothes she took off, and the more excited I got. And then it got weird. When the woman got down to nothing but her underwear, it slowly began to dawn on my thick skull that this was not a woman at all. It was a man. Of course, if I had bothered to read the program, I could have read the name of the soloist, Mr. Ruby Rims. Now, some of you are probably looking at me and thinking to yourself, how gullible can a person be? In my defense, there weren't a lot of drag queens at Oakdale Baptist Church in Raymer, Alabama, that I knew of anyway. Ruby was my first. And while I don't know what you looked like 30 years ago, I do know one thing for certain. The person who began singing the solo that Sunday was a woman. Down to his underwear, Ruby began to dress himself again, this time in men's clothing, as he continued to sing Charles Aznavour's What Makes a Man a Man. I know my life is not a crime. I'm just a victim of my time. I stand defenseless. Nobody has the right to be the judge of what is right to me. Tell me if you can, what makes a man a man? It was a remarkable performance. After Ruby finished, a woman, a real one this time, got up to preach. The Reverend Lee Hancock gave a meditation on Halloween and the masks we hide behind in life and the importance of accepting each other for who we truly are. It was intelligent and challenging, and I left that service thinking this was the farthest thing I had ever experienced. I'd love to tell you that I joined Judson that Sunday, but to be honest, it took me some time before I could stop giggling. It was a man anytime someone mentioned Judson's name. When I finally made it back, I spent the next 4 or 5 years listening to Howard Moody, who taught me that you should never judge a preacher by his flat top. Judson reinvented church for me. I found a freedom here to live the questions, as Rilke once said. Judson allowed me the opportunity to redefine what faith means to me. When I first began attending services here, I was looking for a way to involve myself in the life of the church. Someone asked me to join the Sunday school committee. And even though I don't have any kids of my own, I thought this might be a good way to get to know people. Several years later, when the religious education coordinator's job opened up, I was asked to head up the search committee. The more resumes I read, the more I began to realize that I was kind of qualified for the job. I ended up pulling a Dick Cheney, throwing my own resume on the pile, and Judson hired me. The one thing I asked in taking the job was that I never ever have to be referred to as the religious education coordinator or church school director or Sunday school supervisor or whatever official title the church wanted to go with. As a child, I knew plenty of religious education coordinators, and the thought that I might have grown up to become one of them was too depressing for words. Call it denial if you will, but somehow when the title Grand Poobah came along that first year, I latched onto it for dear life. It had just the right combination of pomposity and ridiculousness that I was looking for. Don't get me wrong, I love this job and I take it very seriously. But I do think the idea of putting me in charge of religious education is probably some kind of weird Judson statement in itself. I'm not a theologian, I'm not an educator per se, and as I said, I don't have any kids. I once had a dog, and I taught him a lot of things, but his idea of God was a cheeseburger. This is my 20th year as Grand Poobah of all things Judson Sunday School. That's a whole lot of lessons to have taught your children, but I thought today that I might share with you the one lesson your children have taught me over the years, and that is this. As important as it is that we educate our children to think and behave like adults, it is just as important that we adults remember what it is like to think and behave like children. Now, for some of us, that's not that big a stretch. We are a city of skateboarding dads and rollerblading moms, and while I haven't been privy to the goings-on inside all of your homes lately, if I had to venture a guess, I would bet that some of the biggest arguments are over Xbox and PlayStation time, not between siblings, but between children and parents. I myself am not a PlayStation or an Xbox person. I'm still trying to master Pong. But when it comes to childishness, no one has anything on me. I usually dress like a 9-year-old. You would literally have to die to get me to put on a suit. I wear a Snoopy watch. I tell people it's because I work with kids. There's something about watching the paws go around the dial that seems to calm them down. But the truth is, I started wearing this watch years before I began working with your kids. Snoopy seems to calm me down as well. But if you're still not convinced of my overall lack of maturity, let me ask you one question. Before your children began rehearsing for today's skit, the Judson Wonder Years, had any of them ever heard of Anthony Weiner? Of course not. Somebody has to teach them Weiner jokes. Who better than the Grand Poobah? I'm not sure Weiner jokes are what Jesus had in mind when he exhorted his disciples to become like children, as Sidney read to us in this morning's ancient testimony. When I was growing up, Jesus' exhortation to become like children was also known as having the faith of a child. And preachers would invariably use this particular passage of Scripture as a call to a return to Christian fundamentalism. I'd like to suggest a different approach this morning. You're welcome. That what Jesus might have had in mind was not so much a return to fundamentalism, but a return to our childlike sense of wonder, to the wonder years, if you will. The wonder years are most often associated with childhood because that is the time in our lives when we are most amenable to amazement and awe, surprise, and curiosity. But there's a spiritual component to wonder as well, which transcends childhood. D.H. Lawrence referred to wonder as our sixth sense, our natural religious sense. Sam Keen, author of Apology for Wonder, says, "To wonder is to perceive with reverence and love. The ultimate way in which we relate to the world as something sacred is by renewing our sense of wonder. Wonder, to me," he says, "is that spiritual stance or disposition which renders us humble in the face of things and also thankful. In my mind, to try and live that way is what it means to follow a sacred path." Now, the call to return to wonder, or this sacred path Keene speaks of, is easier said than done. After all, we're not children anymore. Life has a way of tempering wonder. Our sense of amazement gives way to disbelief. Enchantment becomes apathy. Somewhere along the road, curiosity yields to the daily grind. A perfect example of this comes from stand-up comedian Louis C.K.'s routine on flying. He says people in planes are the worst. They get off the plane, they come to your house, they tell you about their whole flight experience. They make it sound like it was a cattle car in Poland in the 40s. That was the worst day of my life. I had to sit on the runway for 40 minutes. Louis says that's a story in this country. People will listen to that story. They'll stop doing the dishes, turn around, and go, "Oh my God, really? For 40 minutes? That's awful. You should sue them." I had to sit on the runway for 40 minutes. Oh my God, what happened then? Did you fly through the air like a bird incredibly? Did you soar into the clouds impossibly? Did you partake of the miracle of human flight? I had to pay for my sandwich. You're flying. You're sitting in a chair in the sky. You're like a Greek myth right now. Louis says that if the Wright brothers heard us complaining today, they would kick us all right in the, well, never mind. Another impediment on the road to wonder is that we all like to think of ourselves as pretty smart cookies. We have degrees. We've been around the block a time or two. We've seen the sights. We've figured a few things out for ourselves. There's very little room in our lives for the mysterious, for that which cannot be readily explained. But how well something is understood has very little to do with wonder. Sam Keen uses childbirth as an example. You may have had an adequate understanding of the process of conception, gestation, and birth. But the actual birth of your children was as wondrous an event to you as it was for the primitive, who somehow assumed the whole process was caused by the powers of the moon. Surely there is a place in our lives for both reason and wonder. German theologian Otto Rudolph once wrote, "If one subjects everything to reason, our religion will lose its mystery and its supernatural character. If one offends the principles of reason, our religion will be absurd and ridiculous. These are two equally dangerous extremes, to shut reason out and to let nothing else in." In this morning's ancient testimony, the disciples' approach to God is in many ways similar to our approach today. Life is a competition, and God is just something else we compartmentalize, placing further and further restrictions upon the sacred until in the end, God's reach cannot exceed our grasp. For all our learning, our minds tend to grow smaller with age, and Jesus seems to be saying, if only we would approach life with the imagination of children, we might see the unlimitedness of all that is holy, that God, however you choose to define her, lives in possibility, and our wonder years need not be confined to the past. The return to a sense of wonder does not mean we deny the realities of life. It does not mean burying our heads in the sand or sticking our fingers in our ears and shouting, la, 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 I can't hear you, as the brutality of this world passes by in front of our eyes. On the contrary, it is a call to recognize that this world is greater than our brutality. And in spite of all the damage we do to one another, there are still moments of wonder in this life which should humble us and cause us to fall to our knees in gratitude. The wonder in something as simple as the grip of your infant's tiny fist around your finger. The wonder in the laughter of another generation of children as they play on the stage behind me in the shadow of Judson's angels. The wonder of enduring friendships which somehow weather the test of time. Sometimes wonder lives in the memory of those who have gone on before us, like the great, great Howard Moody, who, while he was here, served to teach us well. And sometimes wonder can be found in a drag queen. I want to thank you all for allowing me the privilege of teaching your children these past 20 years. The relationships I've formed with them, as well as you parents, the Pubettes, the church staff, and Judson community as a whole, have served to enhance the quality and meaning of my life in ways I never would have imagined when I first moved to New York City. Perhaps like many of you, I sometimes find myself questioning whether particular events in my life should be chalked up to divine providence or mere coincidence. My liberal progressive mind states unequivocally, coincidence. But then I hear my heart asking, how did you come to be here? And I am filled with wonder. Thank you.